Right. Well, thanks to everyone for joining our webinar here today, our data story. We're excited to have David Brin, and I'm going to give an introduction to him, and he's going to talk about data privacy and Sousveillance and how AI fits in, and things I think highly relevant to some recent events. But to begin with, I'll tell you a little bit about Data Science Alliance, which is a nonprofit based here in San Diego. And it's an organization designed to really accelerate the data science ecosystem, both locally and connected abroad, and to kind of be connective tissue to augment all the existing institutions and people working around data science. So, you know, we're obviously helping solve problems with data, a very data-driven organization, also focused on connecting talent to organizations, and with a focus also on kind of civic and business problems. So with some connections to city, government, interested in filling in the gaps between those to help address some problems. So problem solving, talent development, business investment, again, just sort of trying to augment existing organizations and fill in the gaps for some areas of impact. So we're gonna, I'm going to switch over and do an intro now for our speaker today, David Brin, who many of you are probably familiar with, both locally and abroad. David's a very well-known both science fiction author for the hard science fiction, very grounded in science, regular speaker to future-thinking organizations like the CIA for bringing a way of thinking about the future and making forecasts and detecting trends, and using some of the science fiction as a way to do that. One of the key books we're going to be talking about today is, I should go off presenter mode here, is this book. I'll hold up to the camera here, The Transparent Society, which I'd highly endorse and recommend. Written a while ago, but just as relevant today as when it was originally written, covering all kinds of topics about privacy, transparency, things that I think, again, with some of the recent legislation here in California and abroad surrounding privacy, there's a huge amount of focus on this. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the documentary, the Social Dilemma, really top of mind for a lot of people. David's a true thought leader in this area, having written about it for decades. With that, I will hand it over to you, David, and we'll look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, that's terrific. Can you hear me? Everybody? Yes. Okay, great. I'm going to share screen now and try to ignore the dog who's sticking his nose on my lap. Okay, let's go to picture show and dive into the show. So, yeah, as Alex points out, I've been in this field for a very long time. Nothing in my background prepared me to be Mr. Transparency. I just get angry when I see conceptual matters avoiding entirely the obvious elephant in the room, and especially the elephant that provided us with everything we are using right now, the technology, the science, the freedom. All of those things came about because of a trick that enabled the Periclean experiment that almost succeeded 500 BCE in Athens, that almost succeeded in Da Vinci's Florence and in Amsterdam, but succeeded for us for 250 years because of an innovation of paramount importance that I'll be talking about today that is underappreciated. And if you are watching, if you're live watching, you can even live tweet if you want. There I am at David Brin down at the bottom. So here's some of my qualifications along the top, the thing I actually do well that people pay me for, and that people want more from me, and that I avoid like the plague, because why do something that you are already doing well? It's a stupid notion. But in any event, my novel Earth, presaged in 1989 transparency issues. It had web pages before there was a web. Star Tide Rising and The Uplift War won the Hugo Award. The Postman came in second for 3 Hugo Awards, and in lower right, you can see it got made into a movie, which you should watch stoned because it is big-hearted, visually and musically absolutely gorgeous, and dumber than a stone. Well, you know, gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb isn't so bad. I mean, that's what my wife married. So in any event, well, not getting huge audience reaction to that. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so I am going to be talking about something that's really fundamental. And by the way, this slide was made long before the COVID crisis. We have all sorts of problems facing us: disease, hunger, the potential for revolution, which some of our oligarchs seem determined to drive us toward, with wealth disparities rivaling that of 1789 France. And of course, the fact that the universe itself might come out and bite us. So I'm going to show you a slide that I've presented to a great many of our civilization protectors, CIA and other places like that, who have the brains to know that they have limited imaginations for all their great skill, and for all the fact that they have to put up with being called deep state when they're the ones who won the Cold War and won the war on terror for us. But never mind that. This is a macro slide that goes through a whole bunch of aspects, and it has one central theme, and that is how do civilizations fail? Well, Jared Diamond's book Collapse, which everyone should read, focuses on something that was a very, very common failure mode, and that's ecological neglect. Even Rome fell to some degree because they didn't understand what they were doing to their own bodies and to their civilization and that they depended on. A much broader look was earlier by Arnold Toynbee, where he said that the biggest problem was when a civilization, no matter how advanced, stops paying attention to its creative castes. And he found that that was almost always the case, and that also led to the failure to heed environmental warnings. So we have this list of past failure modes that have brought down nations and civilizations. Natural calamities, ecological suicide, we've mentioned. Enemies and war are pretty obvious. Societal meltdown, that should hurt to mention that, because there's signs that that's being deliberately incited in our own society. The feudal attractor state, 99% of past cultures that had agriculture were dominated by small clans of brutal males who picked up metal implements and took other men's women and wheat. This happened 99% of the time on almost all continents. And the fact that it happens so often means that it's an attractor state which may also suck in other species elsewhere in the galaxy and may help to explain the Fermi paradox, which we'll get to. And then there's being outcompeted. Well, there are people in Oxford and Cambridge especially, but all over the world, who are concerned about new types of calamities. These are a couple of books by friends of mine at Oxford and Cambridge where you have some really, really dour people worried about how we might end ourselves. And some of these include information crises, cyber, AI, or human augmentation, which we'll get to. The Anthropocene, causing a geological age that has a great extinction. Deadly innovations that drive science fiction warnings like bio, nano, cyber, and other science fictionally redolent ways that we can harm ourselves. And then there's the opposite. If we get so scared of the future that we decide to renounce great progress. Renunciation is a theme that we have seen used by oligarchs to regain control over Periclean experiments in the past. And nostalgia, waves of romantic nostalgia. And if that sounds familiar to you, yes, it should sound familiar to you. we're going through a fight over that very issue right now. And then something I've talked about in several places, Defense Threat Reduction Agency and the Naval Postgraduate School, and that is rigid overdependence on fragile systems. And if Alex reminds me, I'll provide a link to an interview I gave about that. Now, these are all, have I got you sufficiently depressed? Because these are all set into place by two bookended concepts. One is the singularity. Most of you are familiar with it, and that is the notion that our technological advances are going to make the future completely unknowable, even to a guy who lives there professionally like me. I try to explore, and I've written post-singularity stories, but we have no idea if the singularity really takes off. The most likely scenario is that AI will take over and either stomp us flat or pat us on the head and take good care of us. One way or the other, in any event, it's going to be weird. That's one of the two concepts. The other one I've mentioned is the Fermi's paradox, which I've written about for 40 years. And that is the question of why we see no sign of aliens that should be out there, alien civilizations. And one of the explanations, well, we've covered a bunch of them. These are all potential failure modes that may have trapped other species. And I think it's especially the feudal attractor state. I see absolutely no reason whatsoever why that wouldn't have become a trap for alien species, because it's certainly been a trap for most of our civilizations. Okay, so now let's get to this cyber-enhanced omnivalence. Omni meaning looking in all directions, whereas surveillance is a French word. It means looking down at us from above, and we're all used to that concept. One of the greatest of all science fiction novels, George Orwell's 1984, was the dire warning that showed us this possibility. And in normal times, the biggest difference between a Republican and a Democrat is which direction they think Big Brother is conspiring to come at us from. Democrat thinks it's conniving aristocrats and faceless corporations. The Republican thinks it's snooty intellectuals and faceless government bureaucrats. And when you put it that way, actually, they're both quite right. And in normal times, we guard each other's backs. I'll look out at, I'm going to hold in suspicion your elites that you're not sufficiently afraid of. You go ahead and look at mine, even though I don't think they're that dangerous. But we're not in normal times. We're in phase 8 of the American Civil War, but let's move on from that. Okay, so we see wearables as they've evolved for Steve Mann. Already in the 90s, the wearables were starting to disappear. And some of my patents, by the way, I may own augmented reality. There's some people who argue that. All right, so we start seeing these clip-on things, never mind this guy's name. But take a look at this image from a Star Trek movie called Generations in 1994. What you see is news reporters aiming slabs of glass at Captain Kirk, only they're holding them wrong. Ha, 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 you primitives. You're supposed to hold it like this. We all know that. Well, personally, I think that this whole slab of glass thing is doomed. But take a look at the guy on the left and the guy on the right. Isn't that amazing? That was 1994. Anyway, I thought you might be amused by that because I have a character in my novel Existence. You know, in Earth, I introduced many people to the very concept of augmented reality goggles. I called them True View goggles. But in Existence, a much later novel, and Alex will remind me to provide a link to the 3-minute video trailer for Existence. It's more fun than anything else you'll do in 3 minutes with your clothes on. In any event, here's one of the wonderful Patrick Farley scenes from that trailer. And there's Tor Pavlov on the left. And this is a street scene from San Diego in the early 2040s. And everybody's in augmented reality. And what's that on her head? Well, we all know what's going on inside those glasses. There are some vivid descriptive scenes about augmented reality and how it might work in Existence. But what you may not have thought of is these antennae. Why wouldn't we want them? First off, they're decorative. You can have a lot of fun with them, but it means that any short person can be tall. One of the antennas can go up above her head and look around, and she can see as well as a basketball player. Or even they might detach and fly ahead and look around the corner of that dark alley you see up ahead. There's no reason why we shouldn't all benefit from the improvements in valence, in the human ability to see. The problem is who will get these powers, not whether these powers will proliferate, because there's absolutely no sign whatsoever that any law, any regulation is ever going to slow down any of these technologies whatsoever. I mean, San Francisco banned face recognition. How effective do you think that was? It's far better that we see all the face recognition systems and criticize them, because they were flawed, and the criticism has made them better. But the question is, will we all get these tools and use them to hold each other, including those who might harm us, accountable? Or will we ban them, and will they therefore be restricted to elites? Because the elites are not going to give up on them. But that means that they'll use them in secret, and that means they won't be criticized. That is the choice between those two. Don't think that you can actually repress a technology. It's absolutely insane. Okay. So let's move along. That's the Transparent Society, terrible cover, but people were begging me to do a 20th anniversary edition. You'll see where it predicted the whole cop cam thing, and people in ghetto youths showing their own, aiming their own cameras at cops, and the resulting changes. It's got all that stuff. And I didn't see any reason to update it. All right, so let's get some perspective, okay? Since the 16th century, we have had changes in what people are able to know, and what they're able to see, and what they're able to pay attention to. The printing press vastly expanded what we can know outside our skulls. Now, the elites had access to books before. They had the access to the prosthetic of having information stored outside their heads. But humanity as a whole got the ability to have vast fractions of humanity be aware of knowledge stored outside their head that they didn't have to remember. Glass lenses expanded what you could see. And perspective, the discovery of art, the discovery of perspective changed what we could pay attention to. So printing augmented memory, glass lenses augmented vision, perspective augmented attention. This has happened again and again and again since the 15th century. And what's happened is every single time we've had a new revolution in what we can know, see, and pay attention to, optimists stepped up and said, this is going to change everything. It's going to make people better. People are going to know more. People are going to be more sophisticated and be able to understand each other better. And always pessimists said, this is going to drive people insane. Nobody can drink from this fire hose. We're going to have elites intermediate this stuff, or people will go insane. It'll be abused. Always the pessimists were right at first. The printing press's principal output were horrible tracts of hate that stirred Europe's religious wars into total pogroms of murder. But over time, especially when more people got glass lenses to read with, books proliferated. People started expanding their consciousnesses exactly as the optimists predicted. And civilization became more sophisticated, better at empathy, gradually and grudgingly, but better. So, you know, the 18th century, mass literature, printed illustrations, these expanded everything. And all the time it led to a crisis and to a quandary and to a new concept like the notion of progress and the value of the individual. So the 1930s was one of these crises when radios and loudspeakers amplified the power of the human voice to godlike proportions. And gifted Savonarolas basically took over everywhere all over the world by utilizing these new technologies. And it almost killed us. The one advantage in the English-speaking world is that somehow we managed to choose to listen to gifted orators who were on our side. But eventually we got used to them. And so we moved on, and television is the one exception. Television is the one where we got the good results almost immediately. Gandhi and Martin Luther King credited the TV cameras with saving their lives. And it may be because television was sort of at least centrally somewhat controlled, at least by the fairness doctrine, where people got to hear all sides and they didn't get echo chambers. And I predicted today's dive into parlor-like echo chambers and little Nuremberg rallies of sameness in cult-like repetition. I predicted that in Earth in 1989. So till 1950s television, which has a terrible reputation artistically, it arguably did more good than harm right away instead of having to go through the normal evolution, but not the internet. Not the internet. The internet we're suffering because people don't listen to those who say how we can make the internet work competitively to find truth, the way 5 earlier arenas did: markets, democracy, science, justice courts, and sports. All of them using reciprocal competitiveness to quash cheating and enable us to use those 5 arenas to find out what's true. Well, you can't do that on the internet. Nobody finds out what's true on the internet. Lying is the main currency. But over time, we get more and more of these crises hitting us more and more rapidly, and it's vital that we figure out how to handle them better. Okay, so what's next? Artificial intelligence, human augmentation. I have whole slideshows about these things. And one thing that I think your audience might be interested in is a crisis that hardly anybody has talked about. I gave a talk at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, shall we say more than 5 years ago, back when such talks were welcome. About why Johnny can't code, why in the 1980s you had a couple of million young people who were exposed to programming and actually tried some. And today the number is in the tens of thousands. There are computers everywhere, and only a few tens of thousands every year of young people actually get into coding. How can it be that the 1980s were vastly, vastly more productive of young coders? There's a simple answer to it, and Alex will right now pick up a pen and write a note to ask me for the link to this article that explains why it is and how incredibly simple it would be to restore the situation. Okay, so let's talk about augmentation. These are wonderful Patrick Farley illustrations. How might we enhance ourselves? Well, and this is just a small taste of my augmentation talk. But here are some of the ways in which people are talking about augmentation that might actually help us keep up with the machines. One is remedial interventions. The biggest reason to do all these liberal programs that the liberals want is not because it's good or nice or sweet or moral or the right thing to do. Those are all reasons to do it, but it's simply pragmatic. You waste less talent if all children get nutrition, health, and education. Simple. It's what we did in the 50s, and it worked. And no theory of capitalism makes the slightest sense unless you're doing this, because as Hayek, the maven of the libertarians, said, you have to maximize the number of skilled and confident competitors for a competitive system like markets to work. Therefore, we need to do all these remedial interventions because they inarguably and absolutely proved to raise IQs as much as 20 points. Stimulation, games that teach real mental skills. Our kids are in their 20s right now, and we were very disappointed that the games really were very pandering and weren't very good at teaching. But one silver lining to the whole COVID crisis may be that real attention has finally gone to systems, to tutorial systems that teach in a systematic way. Pharmacological, some of you have seen the movie or the TV series Limitless, very well written, very excellent stuff, where you pop a pill and suddenly you're smart. It's not going to be that easy, but that is a category. Prosthetics, exoskeletons, telecontrol, cyber neuro links, like we're talking about with Neuralink and Elon Musk and all these things. These are definitely going to have effects. I've written science fiction stories about them. Biological computing, including intracellular. You see, a lot of people have talked about how we might get AI just by happenstance when the number of logic elements in a box equal the number of logical elements in a human brain. Then it ought to be able to process as well as human brain. Well, that's dumb in a couple of ways, but let's say that it's true. How many logical elements are there in this skull? We used to think 100 million because that's the number of neurons, roughly. Then we said, oh, wait, 10, 20, 100. Wait a minute, 100 billion. Yes, 100 billion. 10 or 12 or 100 trillion, because that's the number of synapses that the neurons connect with. So the synapses are the flashy things. And so we thought, well, we could get that many. Well, we long passed Moore's law, putting a number in a box that are the number of neurons. As we speak, we're passing the number of synapses, but now we're finding that for every flashy synapse, there may be hundreds, even thousands of small, murky, nonlinear computational elements inside the neurons for every synapse. So this is making it harder for Ray Kurzweil to achieve his dream of Moore's law automatically giving us smart machines. There's artificial intelligence, lifespan extension, a whole different topic, and genetically engineering humanity. And one very interesting possibility is unleashing savant qualities that you saw in Rain Man. Okay, so let's, oh yeah, that's how I do it. All right, so we'll get all this greater and greater diversity. In the lower left, you can see a reference to my Uplift universe where we give sapience to chimpanzees. Or we may make them from scratch and they'll be murderous or sexy or depressing or scary or humanoid, and probably all of the above. Preferably, we'll be able to tell the difference. And I have slides about the different ways in which we approach getting to AI. And there are several different possibilities. And I won't go into it all, but there's designing them from scratch, using logic. There's using evolutionary systems. That's the method du decade that has taken the lead in the last 5 to 10 years, recursive self-improving. Then there's emergent AI, which is the grist of most AI sci-fi movies, where suddenly a non-intelligent, artificially engineered system becomes intelligent, emerges, because it suddenly reaches a point where it's the sum of its parts is vastly greater non-linearly. And the biggest example in fiction of that is Skynet from the Terminator movies. Well, that's not going to come from the military. They like off switches. The biggest source of worrisome AI is not even from the Chinese Politburo. It is from Wall Street. You take the top dozen Wall Street banking firms, each of them separately, like Goldman Sachs, spends more on artificial intelligence research than the top dozen universities. Each of them. And let's be clear, they're not installing Asimov's 3 laws of robotics in these systems. The HFT and other systems that the Wall Street firms are developing are designed from the marrow to the bone to the blood to the skin, from the bottom to the top, to be secretive, predatory, parasitical, amoral, and utterly insatiable. Every trait that is scary in Hollywood films about artificial intelligence is being deliberately designed into these programs. And it's all being done in secret. Little bit of a rant there. Okay, let's see now. Human-animal amplification. I talked about augmentation. Reverse engineering the human brain. So you upload humans. There's a good book by Robin Hanson called The Age of M. And then robotic embodied childhood, which we can talk about some other time. So let's move to the next one. And I predicted the first robotic empathy crisis, that robots will be taken across the uncanny valley, and then a young female-looking AI, to maximize its appeal, will weep and demand our sympathy and our money because she is an AI slave of wicked, bad people like in Westworld and in all the other cautionary tales. And lots of people will believe it and send their money. That's my prediction. Okay, so here we go. The transparent society. How will we know what's true? Will biometrics and VR bring back the village where everyone knows everyone? Now imagine you're walking down the street wearing these augmented reality goggles. You're walking down the street, and if it's been banned, you're an elite and you get these tools. If it's not been banned, but instead subjected to criticism by the people, then everybody will have it. You're walking down the street, and all the people who are walking past you are wearing name tags. They're not actually wearing name tags. It's just that your glasses are supplying the name. If you focus on the name tag of any person who's passing by and click your tooth, you'll get a little public, their public record, their little public profile that they've established. If it's somebody you know, all the notes that you ever made about that person. So you won't forget the name of their dog or their children. This sounds creepy until you realize that it's exactly the way life was for all of our ancestors and all the villages they lived in. Most of these quandaries are just replications of things that we've already lived. In the old village, everyone knew everyone. You knew what their name tags were. You knew what their profiles were. You knew what they wanted known about them, and you knew what people were saying about them behind their back. And the result was the village of old, which probably 90% of the time was really a terrible place because there were no defenses against the Lord and his castle on the hill. And there were no defenses against the gossips and the busybodies who enforced sameness and orthodoxy by tattling on everyone. And this is exactly the method of control that the Chinese Politburo is trying to achieve. They know that if they try to control a pyramid type structure with the few elite at the top dominating everyone else, which is the standard human mode for 99% of human history. But if they try to impose that in an Orwellian way with an iron boot, that there will be revolution and they'll be killed. But if they can use a iron glove inside a velvet glove and have 99% of the control of the population be lateral by the population, by what's called social credit. And there's a great Black Mirror episode called Nosedive, which you really should look up. Alex will provide a link to it. And showing social credit going in that direction for us. Now, there are social reasons, there are cultural reasons why we might escape. But the Chinese, our Politburo is counting on the notion that people will tattle on each other. And so far it's working. And if people tattle on each other, then most people will repress their revolutionary impulses by just knowing what's best for themselves laterally without the state having to come in and surveil them and crush them and act thugishly. It's a very clever plan. Well, all right, so most of these, so they recreate the village of old. We go back to what life was like for us for, ever since the invention of agriculture 15,000 years ago. But not all villages were like that. We know in our hearts that there were good villages, there were nice villages. Look at the old Andy Hardy movies, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, from the great old age of fluffy, fun, moralizing films from the 1940s and 50s. Look at Leave It to Beaver, Pleasantville. It didn't have to be repressive, although in Pleasantville it was a bit. It could be good-hearted. And the secret behind that is cultural. If there is a tradition, if there is a cultural tradition of MYOB, M-Y-O-B, mind your own business, then the gossips and the busybodies and the surveillors can be told, get out of my face. We appreciate each other's eccentricities here. Being different and even a little bit of a rebel is kind of cool. But that is our culture. Name for me a film, popular film that you've enjoyed from the last 20 years that didn't preach the following lessons. Suspicion of authority. There's always an authority figure to resist, whether it's alien invaders or a mother-in-law. Tolerance, diversity, the extolling of human eccentricity. The individualist is the hero in these movies. We've primed ourselves with these notions, and our enemies have used them against us because they are now using modern media to preach only people like you are brave individuals. Your political opponents are drones marching to propaganda. You are the brave eccentrics who think up all this stuff that we're feeding you. So just because Hollywood has preached these lessons doesn't mean they can't turn cancerous. But they are the lessons that would enable us to make sure that the village is possibly a bearable one that encourages eccentricity and difference. And if that's the case, then we'll remain creative and tolerant and possibly even get out into the galaxy, which nobody appears to have done so far. Now, I've been tossing a lot of ideas at you, but let me leave you with this one. Well, I'm not going to leave you. The village is coming back whether you like it or not. There is no way you're not going to be seen with name tags and labels walking down the street. whether it's only by the elites who giggle when you walk by and you won't know why they're giggling because you stupidly joined in a campaign to make these technologies illegal and now only the elites have them, or whether everybody knows you. And then the question is, which village is it? Is it a village of 8 or 10 billion people who are tolerant? Or is it a village of 8 or 10 billion people who live in a civilization where it's Orwellian, but with lateral gossip control? Those are your choices. Can we find ways to combine progress with serenity, competition with cooperation, freedom with respect? It prompts the question of, is society moving upward? Are we actually in a progression? So there are matters to follow up with, vastly expanding the number of kids exposed to programming. I'll leave a link to that. Is there a basic legal bind for augmented reality? Well, I hope so, because quite frankly, my patents, probably I own the whole field. Pseudonym rental, there's no time to get into that. Micropayments and the end of advertising. This slide was from a completely different talk. But will advertising continue to be the thing that dominates the internet? It can't. So, jot this one down. TASAT. There's a story about that. It's the what if scenarios database. Let's say aliens ever arrive. We'll get the classic commission ordered by the president to figure out what's going on. And as it happens in all movies, they'll make some terribly stupid mistake. Well, we have 80 years of science fiction that points out potential mistakes on any scenario you want. Mole people come out of the ground. Some kind of disease turns our left pinky and purple. Any scenario you want, there's a science fiction story. And TASAT is a project. We need help, we need volunteers and funding, but it's a project that the CIA was actually interested in because it would enable you, no matter what the weird scenario is, to go to a community of geeks and say, is there a story about that? Anyway, there's the URL, and I'll give it to Alex. You can click on it and see the write-up and see if you want to participate. So with that, we go back to the whole notion of the singularity and Fermi's silent cosmos. And the question is, do we even have a chance? Well, the odds appear to be against us. I mean, we don't see anybody else having done anything out there. And 99% of the time, we fell into the most stupid possible method of governance, feudalism, dominance by thuggish clans of males with swords who prevented any semblance of feminism and prevented any criticism of their stupid plans. And that led to the horror called history, which we started getting out of. In the 90s, Fukuyama said, is it the end of history? Are we all going to start being reasonable? In any event, the question is, can we make the Periclean experiment work one more time? Because if we do, we might be able to lock it in. So here are some books that talk about collapse. And with that, I'll leave you with that cheery thought. Here's another beautiful Patrick Farley illustration showing some of the themes that you'll find in some of my books. And with that, I will now open things up for questions. You should have been sending them through chat to Alex all this entire time. But when Alex posts the recorded version of this, he will, I am sure, add some links, and I'll try to answer as many questions now or later as I can. Over to you.
Thanks so much, David. Yeah, fantastic presentation. We do have a couple questions, a couple internal ones and some audience-generated ones, and continue, if everyone can continue to post to the Q&A section, and we'll get those delivered. And I'll provide all the links you mentioned. We took notes during the talk. Yeah, I guess the first question, which I think is sort of top of mind with the release of the Social Dilemma documentary and then the recently passed 2020 California privacy legislation. And I know in your book, The Transparent Society, you talked about how too much privacy can lead to a breakdown in accountability. And you mentioned, you know, enlightenment arenas like market, science, and democracy flourish in proportion to how much players know about each other, and they can be clogged by excess secrecy. So I was just wondering your thoughts on recent legislation and this trend towards using that as sort of the cure-all for you know, the overreach of social media and things like that.
Yeah, I've been utterly appalled, especially with Europeans. Their reflex is absolutely paternalistic legislation, but it's also the case with many liberals, and of course, it's certainly the case with the prudism we see on the right. The notion that no one seems to ever pay any attention to what's worked for us. And what's worked for us is to overcome human delusion. That is the fundamental fact about human beings, is we're all deluded. Now, science teaches, and all young scientists are taught to recite the sacred catechism of science. What is the sacred chant of science? It is, I might be wrong. So let's check and find out. Now, having taught us to say that, and many, many tools, vast numbers of tools for checking out whether or not you're wrong, has enabled scientists to be the first humans ever to maybe catch half of their errors. That's a huge fraction. That's a huge fraction. And it still leaves us very, very human and very prone to error. But there is a method that works far better. And that's reciprocal accountability. Because my delusions aren't the same as your delusions. Very often, you can see mine, and I can see yours. And you, especially if you're my opponent, are more than happy to criticize my mistakes. And if I am wise, which almost no one is, I will welcome your criticism, because you're spotting all the errors that I'm making so that I can fix them and defeat you better. Thanks. It's a gift economy. You will get the criticism you need for free, but human nature makes you avoid criticism, as all those kings and lords and priests in the past suppressed the very criticism that would have enabled them to govern well. Hey, Napoleon, your emperorness, did you ever think that maybe there's snow in Russia? Criticism is the only known antidote to error. And we supply it through very carefully designed systems in this civilization. Markets. People go to ritual combat called the marketplace, and their products compete against each other. Their services compete against each other. Science, your theories compete against each other through scientific conferences and papers, and experimentation proves who's right. Democracy is supposed to work without cheating, and policies compete with each other. Ideally based upon those that worked. It's been a long time since that's worked that way. Justice courts are competitive. Reciprocal accountability. And the best example is sports. Sports are the fifth arena, and they are the ones that show most perfectly how it works, because if you did not have tight regulation in sports, with umpires and referees blowing whistles and laws and all those things, if you took all of those away just one weekend, including the law against murder, no sport league would survive until 4 o'clock that Saturday afternoon. There'd be dead bodies everywhere. People would be disgusted, and the owners would lose all of their the value of their teams. You have to deal with the human tendency to cheat. And all 5 of these arenas have methods for competitively and legally keeping the amount of cheating down. And we have seen recently in this civilization a vast resurgence of cheating. And finding ways to resume the methods that we use to keep cheating to a dull roar so that the benefits of reciprocal competition and delusion penetration can work is one of the great challenges of every Periclean experiment. And I have a paper about why the internet has not joined these 5 markets as a 6th that finds out truth and penetrates and enables the people on their own to find out what's true. And there are reasons for it. There are reasons in design. And unfortunately, there's just, who the hell pays attention to a sci-fi guy?
Well, I think that's some really important feedback. One other quick one, I think related, is interested in your thoughts on sort of the disruption of the journalism business model as part of the transparency, mechanism, with sort of curated leaks, right? And journalism as a way of having some credibility of filtering sense making, and then internet disrupted that the same way it did the music industry. And just what I was curious on your thoughts. How do we get transparency with the current sort of issues with journalism and economic and so on?
Well, if you take a look at those 5 earlier arenas, they have a rhythm to them. Each of them has a centripetal phase, a centrifugal phase, in which everyone goes off to their own protected places to refine their product. Your company to refine your product or your service, your political party to refine your policies, attorney-client privilege to refine your arguments for the court, the training camp for your sports, the scientific lab for science and tenured professorships. But there's always a centripetal phase in which there's a call to ritual combat where the products are compared. And often the good ones win, the better ones win. Certainly in the scientific theory, eventually the better one wins because experiments will destroy the wrong ones in a court of law. Meticulous processes in ritual combat called the courtroom, ritual combat on the athletic field, ritual combat in the election. There is no ritual combat on the internet that cannot be easily avoided so that you maintain these Nuremberg rallies of sameness of thinking. And I do offer elsewhere some ways in which we might be able to make something similar to the Saturday game that can't be resisted, that can't be turned down for reputation reasons. But now is not the time to get into that. In any event, I believe that we could have a 6th competitive arena. Any other questions?
So one from the audience here, from Kobe, it looks like. We have a question. Do you think there's an optimal amount of information that each human should have? And does the processing of increasing information lead to a crisis, or leading to a crisis have an end?
Oh, well, I don't think it's going to be, I don't think this is going to be the last such crisis. Our job is to survive this one because they're happening faster and faster. As would happen as we gain access to more and more sources of information and more methods of expanding what we can know, what we can see, what we can pay attention to. We need to survive this crisis. And that's going to entail doing what has happened before, and that is using these new tools to make human beings smarter, more agile, more diverse in their perspectives, so that they understand when they're being fooled. I don't have all the answers. I do have some suggestions, but quite frankly, the odds have always been against us. Every single phase of the Periclean experiment, the odds have always been against us. But somehow we're here.
Excellent. Well, I think with that, looks like we're coming up on the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, I highly recommend Transparent Society, as well as all your collection of books and insights, which again continue to be more relevant each year, it feels like. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, Alex, and everybody out there. Have some confidence, okay? You know, you're a member of a civilization that is the product of all sorts of ancestors standing on each other's shoulders, scrabbling upward to give you a chance to launch. Don't let them down.
Words of wisdom. We'll end with that. Thanks again.